John DeCamp's book had some revelations in it, and Conspiracy of Silence had some revelations. I took a lot of the Conspiracy of Silence footage. The Conspiracy of Silence that made it onto the internet didn't have the Boys Town section, where Boys Town kind of banished them. I've spent a lot of time with a lot of these victims, and I've got a lot more footage on the victims, and it's really horrific what happened to them, but ultimately they were used, I believe, by our government. There were two primary ringleaders. One was Lawrence King Jr. of Omaha, Nebraska, and the other one was Craig Spence. He was a power broker in Washington, D.C. And Craig Spence had a house that was wired for audio and visual, and a lot of these parties would occur at his house. And big-time politicians were brought there. I can give you the names of some of the politicians and journalists. Journalists like Eric Severeid, Ted Koppel, William Safire, former Attorney Generals John Mitchell and Elliot Richardson. CIA Director William Casey was quite fond of Craig Spence's house, as was Ray Klein, former Deputy Director of Intelligence for the CIA. Lieutenant General Dan Grant, former Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and General Alfred M. Gray, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and former Senators John Glenn of Ohio, Frank Murkowski of Alaska, and Richard Stone of Florida, and Ambassadors Roger Newman and James Woolley. They all attended Craig Spence's parties. Now, I'm not saying that all of them are compromised, and all of them are blackmailed, and all of them are pedophiles, but the names of some of these politicians that have come up, and actually some of the journalists too, that are compromised are kind of mind-boggling. And I mean, the system is perfect. You take a kid from a lower socioeconomic background, and you basically molest them, turn them on to drugs, and they go on to commit crimes, and they go on to compromise themselves. And Rube Fox, who I interviewed there, he did 10 years for armed robbery, and I have no doubts that he's a victim of Larry King's. And Ulysses Washington was the first kid to come forward. I interviewed her there, and she was at a party in Chicago where she said that she saw a very eminent politician, and to this day she says that. And she came from a foster care system. And now, a lot of people say, well, why would they get kids out of Boys Town, or why would they get kids out of the foster care system? The thing about Boys Town, and especially the draconian foster care systems that these kids came from, socialize these kids. You cannot take a kid off the street and put him in with a high-ranking member of the administration or a senator. I mean, they have to be taught deference, they have to be taught respect, and Boys Town did that, and these foster care homes did that. And the amount of federal firepower that went in to cover up Franklin is actually quite mind-boggling. The FBI has been mentioned. The Department of Justice led it, and also in Washington, D.C. A lot of people aren't really familiar with the D.C. machinations of this. I mean, Craig Spence's name has come up, but in Washington, D.C., it was primarily the Secret Service, and in Washington, D.C., it was the Department of Justice too, but there were ultimately 3 grand juries that were compromised to cover this up. And there were 2 grand juries in Omaha, Nebraska, and there was a grand jury in Washington, D.C. And I've got the transcripts of the state grand jury that declared that this was a hoax. And in my book, I bring the reader right into a grand jury, which it's illegal for me to have those documents, and I could potentially do time for it. But I just felt it was so corrupt and perfidious that I really had to show people how corrupt this grand jury was. Because according to state and federal law enforcement, Larry King never abused a single child. And what is amazing about this is the Omaha World Herald is called Pravda the Plains, and they really played an integral role in covering this up. The New York Times also played an integral role in covering this up. And in the Washington, D.C. side, it was the Washington Post that played a really integral role in covering this up. And also Esquire Magazine and CBS. I mean, all of these media outlets played a real integral role in covering this up. The government called in all their markers. Now, I don't know if people in the New York Times or at the Washington Post are compromised. Well, I kind of think someone very high at the Washington Post is compromised. But markers were called in. So basically, to cover this up, and this was an interstate pedophile network. I've got like 200 flight receipts. The kids were flown all over. And all the kids that I've talked with have been flown to the East Coast, to the West Coast, and they've been flown all over. So ultimately, to cover it up, there were 3 grand juries and also national media and local media was used to cover this up. That's why the average American has never heard of this. And what I find is absolutely mind-boggling about this is that most people in Nebraska knew that this was a cover-up. I would say 75 to 90% of Nebraskans knew that something went down. I mean, they were very good at keeping it out of the national media other than the hatchet jobs done by the New York Times and the Washington Post. But Franklin is really an example of how the government can make truth and turn it into lies, and take lies and turn it into truth. Now, there were 2 kids that refused to recant. The FBI came in with a full-court press, and 2 kids refused to recant. Alicia Holm was one, and Paul Benassi was the other. And they decided to try Alicia Holm first.